Hi, I'm Warrick from Harder & Steenbeck, and we're on a mission to convince all of you that airbrushing is easy. So today we're going to give you a video which addresses what we believe are the 14 most important things that trip beginners up when they're starting out. Why 14? I'm a fan of the number 7 and it's a multiple of that. Okay, so the first one that we're going to talk about is I believe that many people just don't spend enough time learning the trigger before they go on to the first piece of work that they really care about. Now, you've probably spent quite a long time deciding to buy the airbrush, so why not just take a little bit more time before you go on to the first job that you really want to do well, just to really learn that trigger. Now, we've got a lot of other videos on this particular topic, but I'm just going to recap a couple of simple things that you can do which really just help you to get control of the trigger. First thing I'll just say very quickly is, of course, the Ultra does a little bit of this for you, because the first thing you really need to learn about the double action trigger is that you always have to push it down first to start the air, then pull it back to release whatever quantity of paint you want to release, then push it forward and then stop the air. It's always that sequence that gives you a tidy start and a tidy end to whatever stroke you've done. The Ultra helps you to do that because you can't pull the Ultra's trigger back until you've pressed it down, and it won't go up until it's been pressed forward. However, whether or not you've got an Ultra, as long as you bear that in mind, it's going to help you to get that double action trigger control first sorted. So always down first, then back, then forward, then up. The first stroke you should practice when you first picked up your airbrush is just simply this. Point it at a piece of paper, press down, pull back, see the color build, press forward to stop, and come back up, so that you just get this nicely controlled little dot of color in the place that you're aiming. Be wary of pulling back too far. Also make sure that you've either used a paint which is already fully prepared for the airbrush. In terms of what paint you might want to use, almost anything works great through the airbrush if it's a designated airbrush paint, if you thin it 1-to-1 with the thinner from that brand. There's more and more paints now which you can put straight in. Some of the inks and so on just work absolutely beautifully. Right now I'm using the new Army Painter Air, which actually seems to spray really rather well without thinning. But if you've got any doubt about the paint you're using, actually thinning it a little bit more is going to help you to get control of the trigger, because the paint will flow a bit more and you'll need to learn how to modulate that. So just getting back to the exercises that we want to do to really get control of that trigger. The main thing you want to understand is what is the difference that happens when you pull it back more or when you pull it back less. The best way to investigate this when you're starting out is, again, with a piece of paper, press down and then start moving the airbrush around on the paper. Don't pull it back yet, but just start moving it around, and then gradually start to pull the trigger back and just watch what happens. And you'll see that with the small trigger movement, we've got a very diffuse line. Okay, and as we pull that back further, it starts to become more and more intense in how much color goes down. And as we back off, it becomes more diffuse. So experiment with that line until you start to get a feel for the relationship between how far you pull the trigger back, gives you a more intense color build. When you pull it back less, it gives you a more diffuse color build. And once you've experimented with that a little bit and you feel a bit more confident with it, then start doing lines where you start diffuse, get intense, and end diffuse. So it's like this. Once you've got that, you've got 3 key skills. You've mastered the 1, 2, 3, 4, down, back, forward, up of the double action trigger. You've got some idea of how far you pull the trigger back is a relationship to the color build that you're seeing on the surface. And you started to learn the coordination of moving your hand over the surface you're painting whilst operating your trigger finger. That gives you a really good set of basics to go on to your first piece that you're painting onto that you really care about the results on. So please try to master those basics before you go on to something that you really want to do a great job on. Just before we leave that topic, there's a bunch of videos that we've made on trigger control in our Essentials series that go into much more detail and give you some other exercises to really expand on your trigger control. So once you're done with watching this one, if you feel inspired to really work on your mastery of the airbrush, why not go and check out a couple of those videos too to really get to know what your airbrush can do. Okay, now the second topic in our list of 14 is not having a powerful enough compressor. I don't want to kind of get onto this one as if I'm trying to tell you to spend, because of course everybody needs to spend what they can afford and no more. But the reality of it is that if you've got a compressor that doesn't have enough power to run your airbrush at least 20 psi, ideally 25 to 28, it's going to put you in a position where you struggle to get the one thing that I believe the airbrush uniquely offers, which is this beautiful, incredibly diffuse blend of color. So the ability to take any color and control the hue of it to any of its values. And having enough air pressure at your compressor is important for that. So for my opinion, get something that can develop at least 20 psi with your airbrush attached. As a side note to that, there are lots of these little systems out there with very, very tiny compressors. I think they can work as long as the airbrush has been specifically designed to work with a compressor like that. If not, we generally always tend to see that the atomization is not particularly good. You get this kind of grainy effect. What that does when you're working on a non-porous surface like a motorcycle crash helmet or a miniature or an aviation model is you tend to get a little bit of a rough finish, so that you have to build the color up wet to get it to flow. And what that means is you're then really limited just to things like full blanket priming and full blanket base coating and not really a whole lot else. The third point that I want to make, and it's a really easy one, and I would really encourage you, do not miss this one, is always use the matching thinner for your brand of paint that you're using and the matching cleaner for your brand of paint that you're using. The reason is there's a lot of compatibility, but there are one or two brands out there which are not compatible. And the very, very last thing that you want to contend with when you're starting out is doing that and then having plasticization of the paint in your airbrush. It's an absolute nightmare to get out of there, and it can happen when you mix certain brands of acrylic together with the wrong chemicals. So the easy way out of that one is, if you're using Army Painter paint, use their thinner, use their cleaner. If you're switching to a Vallejo color, use their thinner, use their cleaner, and etc., etc., etc. Very, very valuable point. Sounds obvious, but when we're in the heat of painting, sometimes we just reach for what we've got, and that can be the result, and it's very much best avoided. Now this one is something that everybody's done at some point or another, and there's lots of good reasons not to do this, and that is mixing too much paint in the cup of your airbrush. Now, there's a couple of reasons why you don't want to do it. The first one is if you've got too high of a paint level in the cup and you're moving the airbrush over something, you can splosh the paint out of the cup. Now, nobody wants to do that, obviously, because it makes a bit of a mess. Our airbrushes, we try to be mindful of that by designing our cups that they all have a return at the top of the cup, so that if you do slosh a bit, it's going to slosh the paint back into the cup rather than out of it. But there's still a chance that it could happen. The other reason why it's a bad idea is obviously it wastes a bit of paint. And then of course when you come to clean your airbrush, you're just waiting for ages to spray out all that excess paint that you mixed up. And obviously you lose time, you lose flow, and you kind of lose that creative energy when you're just waiting for it to spray out. Generally speaking, when you're starting, be prepared to be shocked at how much coverage your airbrush will give you from a very, very small amount of paint. For example, if you're looking to completely prime, let's say a Space Marine, you're going to probably get away with doing that with about 5 drops of paint and 5 drops of thinner max. So don't put too much in there. You can always put a bit more in, and it actually keeps your workflow running a bit faster. Okay, the next tip that we're going to talk about is overloading with too many variables. Now this one is super important, so I really hope that most of you are still with us on this video. So you can look at this, there's two groups of things on this. One is too much gear. Now, it might be surprising to you that a company like Harder and Steenbeck would ever talk about the possibility of having too much gear. Of course, there's gear at the right time. So for example, if you're starting out in airbrushing and you've got a really nice practical head size, for example, our 0.45, and you decide that you want to start exploring detail and you've never started to explore detail, your first step should absolutely not be to rush out and buy our 0.28mm setup. Your first step should be exploring the detail capability of your 0.45. Why is that a better approach? Because you've already got familiarity with that setup. And so when you're starting to learn a new skill with it, you're going to start with more familiarity on the way the trigger feels and responds. And for something like detail, which is a little bit of a challenge to learn, I really think you're going to get your best results in starting by working with something that's familiar. As soon as you've then discovered, like, oh, okay, so this is how it works, I get really close, I pull the trigger back a bit less, I understand how to prepare my paint. Once you've learned those things, which don't take very long, and you've developed some confidence, then introduce the variable of a detail head system, because you're going to be much better prepared to exploit that slightly trickier, smaller setup and get great results that aren't frustrating to find in your first session. You'll get to them right away if you've already learned a bit of detail skill on the setup that you're already accustomed to. The other interpretation of too many variables is things like air pressure, paint thinning, different paint brands. Listen to the people who paint around you, because obviously they're the ones who are going to give you the most amount of information, and try to use paint brands that they are already comfortable with. And then use a mix, one mix when you're starting out. So for example, let's say you're using Vallejo Game Air when you're starting out. I would suggest start out using that stuff like with a 1-to-1 thin. Okay, 1 part thinner to 1 part paint. And just stick with that as you learn the basics, as you learn how to blend, as you learn how to prime, as you learn how to do a zenithal highlight and a detail highlight, line work, spot work. Just stick with that, because then you've eliminated paint as a variable and you're able to just learn trigger response. Okay, very important. The other one is air pressure. People will talk to you and say, you know, when you're trying to do detail, maybe drop the pressure a bit because it slows the delivery down and all this kind of stuff. It is super useful later on in your journey, but when you're learning these things for the first time, you just don't want the variables. The only variable that you want to focus on is getting control of the airbrush, and there's essentially 3 parts to that. Number 1 is how far back do you pull the trigger. Number 2 is how far are you away from the surface, and these 2 things have a relationship. And the third one is how quickly you're moving the airbrush over the surface. That's all you want to focus on. Everything else as a variable, you want to try to eliminate that as you're starting out, and your progression will be so much faster for it. I hope you found it really helpful. These are the things that I constantly found myself talking to when I used to teach people, and the things that I constantly see coming up in the comments. So I hope it's been helpful to you. If there's any clarifying questions you'd like to ask, please do it, and we'll make sure to give you those answers. Thank you so much for being with us.